Hi everyone, this is lesson number 5 where we'll be evaluating the impact of Brown v. Board of Education, specifically on the U.S., on race relations, and on desegregation efforts around schooling. To make sure we have an understanding, a background context for the Brown v. Board case, we want to make sure we understand what the Supreme Court had already decided back in the 1890s with the Plessy v. Ferguson case. This case decided that separate but equal would be constitutional. Of course, these resources, public accommodations, transportation, etc., these things were not equal. They were often under-resourced for Black communities and well-resourced for white communities. Nevertheless, Plessy v. Ferguson ignored that inequality and ruled that these Jim Crow segregation laws were constitutional. Plessy v. Ferguson, you might remember from our previous lessons, was a situation where Black lawyers used a test case strategy to recruit Homer Plessy, who was a white-passing Black man in Louisiana, to board a trolley car, essentially, and announce that he was Black. At that point, he was arrested. And so therefore he had standing to sue. This particular challenge to Jim Crow segregation had failed. However, the fight continued, and in the Brown v. Topeka Board of Education case in 1954, the Supreme Court reversed its Plessy v. Ferguson decision and ruled that this separate but equal ruling violated the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. Brown v. Topeka Board was actually a set of several cases in which Black students and their families had sued because they were denied entry, admissions to a white school in their area. Among those was not just Topeka Board of Education in Kansas, but also a case that was taking place in Delaware State. Of course, we probably have an understanding that these conditions were a general pattern of under-resourced Black schools and well-funded white schools. While this was not 100% always the rule, this was the general pattern that has continued up to today, and we'll talk about that in the next video. A little bit of backstory here. So there was in the 40s and 50s and 60s a Latinx civil rights movement as well. And in California, they had won under the leadership of a group called the League of United Latin American Citizens, had won a California Supreme Court case where Orange County schools were ordered desegregated. This led and prompted California legislature to repeal all school laws that had required racial segregation. This was signed into law by Errol Warren, who was the California governor at the time, later Chief Justice of the Supreme Court during the Brown v. Board case. Warren has a darker past as well, where as Attorney General, he oversaw the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. Japanese Americans were targeted and incarcerated in concentration camps across the West, scapegoated as a kind of marked as enemies due to the U.S. being at war with Japan. Interesting kind of sidebar fact about that was that they used the census illegally, revealed the census, individual census data for individual people to target them as Japanese American. And that was one way that they were able to kind of quickly and efficiently incarcerate so many people. Typically, by law, census data on the individual level is not supposed to be released until 70 years later. All right, moving forward, Thurgood Marshall becomes another important figure in the Brown v. Board case. He was the NAACP chief counsel in the case, later becomes the first Black Supreme Court justice. There's an argument used to persuade the kind of all-white Supreme Court justices at the time to locate the problem with segregation as a problem that leads to a feeling of inferiority among Black children. The Kenneth and Mamie Clark Doll studies from, I believe, the 40s, perhaps the late 30s, were used to argue that this was the case. And if you watch the video, you'll notice that Black children have in these studies associated positive qualities with white dolls and negative qualities with black dolls. And so the argument went that this in the Brown v. Board context, that segregation negatively impacted and impaired black children in this kind of psychological sense. Now, if you listen to the Miss Buchanan Revisionist History podcast, you'll notice that there's an argument that this locating the problem in the psychology of black children and in the sense of inferiority ignores a larger structural argument that it's really the problem was black schools did not have the resources needed to ensure a quality education. And here we see Brown v. Board locate the problem in this sense of inferiority among black children. So they argue that segregation of white and colored children in public schools has a detrimental effect upon the colored children. The impact is greater when it has the sanction of the law, for the policy of separating the races is usually interpreted as denoting the inferiority of the Negro group. A sense of inferiority affects the motivation of a child to learn. Segregation with the sanction of law therefore has a tendency to retard or slow down the educational and mental development of Negro children, depriving them some of the benefits they would receive in a racially integrated school system. Therefore, they conclude that separate but equal has no place. So the consequence of this, you want to ask yourself, well, what would then be the solution if this is the problem? The solution then is to expose black children to white students and white schools. That's the solution according to this framing. Rather than, well, let's make sure we fully fund black schools. Of course, the argument goes that, and black families who sued were arguing they don't want to be denied the chance to attend a white school. But focusing the problem in the psychology of black children means that the overall argument of racist policy of inequitable resources kind of gets overlooked in the Brown v. Board case. So at this point, you want to take time to do your own conceptual analysis of the impact of Brown v. Board of education. I want you to use the documentary you should have watched from Eyes on the Prize on Little Rock. That particular source will help you understand the impact on black children attending white schools. In this case, black youth, high school level. It'll also help you understand the local white community response to Brown v. Board, and you can look at that as part of the impact as well. The Source B Revisionist History podcast will help you understand the impact on black teachers during the desegregation process. Source C will help you understand the impact in terms of timing. How long would desegregation take? You have to do some good inferencing with Source C. Brown 2, the implementation decision, is basically the Supreme Court issuing guidance. And so you can take a look at that. That is available on the Brown, on the same Google Classroom post where you'll find the documentary and the podcast. And finally, Source D, in the same document with Brown 2, or in the same Google Doc, Southern Manifesto was signed by 101 white Southern representatives and senators, and that'll help you understand the impact or the response of white politicians during the time, soon after Brown v. Board. So take a moment to do that analysis. We did this in class with breakout rooms. You can do this on your own or with a friend, and then you can come back to the end of this video, where I'll just give a quick overview. So the quick overview, if we're looking at Source C, the implementation decision, this helps us understand. You might have done some good inferencing here where you would have noticed that this argues that school authorities have the responsibility for solving the problems of the kind of segregation issues. But what they do, because of the issues being so locally focused, the Supreme Court remands or sends back to the lower courts so that the lower courts would enter such orders and decrees consistent with this opinion as are necessary and proper to admit to public schools on a racially non-discriminatory basis with all deliberate speed. That language of all deliberate speed is intentionally vague so that they don't kind of set deadlines. And therefore, it's really up to lower courts. The federal courts were largely supportive of school desegregation whenever local districts and states tried to stop efforts. Federal courts did step in. However, with the all deliberate speed, some lower courts, especially more at the state level, would not be as supportive, although federal courts were. But that court process takes time. The Southern Manifesto is going to help us understand that there's going to be a lot of obfuscation or barriers put in place by white politicians in the South in particular. So we have these Southern members of the Senate and House saying, and if you read the end here, we commend the motives of those states which have declared the intention to resist forced integration by any lawful means. We pledge ourselves to use all lawful means to bring about a reversal of this decision. If you pair this with the documentary, you'll notice that Virginia and Arkansas are among the states who shut down their schools to prevent integration and desegregation efforts. And this largely impacts Black students more than it impacts white students, because more white students were able to, establish private schools and figure out alternative means for education. Black students were also able to do that to some extent, but it impacts them a little bit more due to financial inequalities and inequities. If you notice in the Little Rock documentary from Eyes on the Prize, Black students were largely encountering racism and racist language and harassment and attacks at their schools. And so, some of them fought back and were suspended for it. You might remember the story of Minnie Jeans being verbally assaulted, and she dumps her chili on top of the boy who was harassing her. And in response, all the Black workers at the school cafeteria in Little Rock, applauded her, but she was suspended after that. So anyhow, that documentary helps us understand that Black students were encountering a lot of harassment, and there was a white mob reaction to try and prevent integration. Malcolm Gladwell's podcast on revisionist history helps us understand that Black teachers were largely not integrated. Black students were to some extent. Black teachers not really at all. In fact, many lost their jobs, especially as they were trying to apply to schools that were getting integrated. They would often be overlooked, downgraded in their scores, and intentionally overlooked and not hired. And so many Black teachers lost their jobs. And we want to ask, what does this do to Black students at schools where they're going to be facing racist harassment? What will happen when they don't have Black teachers who understand that experience and only have white teachers? And so these are important questions to ask and to understand that, Black teachers lost their jobs as a result of desegregation efforts after Brown v. Board. So we want to evaluate, right? We want to evaluate that narrative that Brown v. Board was this kind of praising of it as a positive experience. And while it's great that legalized segregation was made unconstitutional, we want to understand the more complex and nuanced story. And it's important to note that, right, that the Brown v. Board makes de jure or legal segregation unconstitutional. It doesn't say, segregation of schools due to residential segregation that exists is unconstitutional. So this is going to impact its long-term, whether or not it can, ensure integrated school system in the long term, which we'll look at in the next video. So hopefully you've filled out this concept web, and next video, we're going to look at a set of visualized data and graphs to evaluate school segregation in recent years. So I hope you can join me for that. Continue to take care of yourselves during this pandemic, and let me know if there's anything that you need.